I was about to sign over my entire company to my son. My daughter-in-law placed a cup of healthy herbal tea in front of me, her smile almost too perfect to trust. Just as I lifted the cup toward my lips, the housekeeper suddenly bumped into the table and whispered urgently, "Don't drink it. Please, just trust me." I pretended I hadn't heard anything, but when they turned their backs, I quietly switched the cups. Just a few minutes later, the person lying unconscious on the floor was no longer me. Welcome everyone, and thanks for being here. Before we continue, like the video, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Quick note: this is a fictional story with dramatized details for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is coincidental, but the message is intended to be meaningful and beneficial. The porcelain rim of the teacup was cold against my lip, but the steam rising from Lillian's special blend carried a cloying sweetness that made my stomach turn before I even took a sip. I, Thane Garrison, at 71 years old, still stood as the active CEO of Garrison Land Holdings, a company I built from nothing into a $31 million empire. Lately, however, my grip on that empire had felt like it was slipping through a thick, unnatural fog. It was a cognitive haze that seemed to have descended upon me with surgical precision, coinciding perfectly with the moment my daughter-in-law had insisted on taking over my morning tea ritual to help with my health. I sat at the head of my mahogany table in Highland Park, the weight of my legacy resting in a single fountain pen. My son, Merritt Garrison, a 44-year-old man who served as my VP of Finance, walked into the study with a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. He tapped his pen rhythmically on the unsigned succession papers, the sound echoing like a countdown against the polished wood. Beside Merritt stood his wife, Lillian, a 39-year-old woman whose beauty was as sharp and cold as a surgical blade. She watched my every movement with a fixed, expectant grin that felt more like a predator marking its prey. Just a signature, Dad Merritt urged, his voice smooth, yet betraying a frantic edge. "Then you can finally rest." Lillian nodded her hand, hovering near my shoulder. "Drink up, Thane," she whispered. "It is the herbal blend I told you would help with that brain fog. Have you ever looked at your own flesh and blood and realized you were looking at a stranger wearing your son's face?" I stared at Merritt, wondering when the boy I raised had been replaced by this man who looked at me like a hurdle rather than a father. The pressure in the room was suffocating a silent demand for my departure from the world I had spent 44 years constructing. I felt the heat of the liquid through the delicate china, yet my blood ran cold. The silver spoon rattled against the saucer, a death knell in a quiet room. The sound seemed to snap the tension for a fleeting second, drawing my attention to the doorway. Leona Ross, my 57-year-old housekeeper, who had been the backbone of this Highland Park estate for 2 decades, stood by the sideboard with trembling hands. She had entered to clear a stray saucer, but she remained frozen, her gaze locked onto the cup nearing my mouth. I noticed her hands were not just shaking. They were vibrating with a primal terror as she looked from the tea to Lillian. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that moment the calm I had maintained for decades shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of doubt. "Mr. Garrison," she stammered, her voice thin and brittle. "The documents are getting wet." It was a weak excuse, a desperate attempt to break the trance of the room. I paused the tea just inches from my tongue, the cloying scent now smelling less like herbs and more like an ending. Lillian's eyes flickered toward Leona, a flash of pure, venomous irritation crossing her features before the mask of the dutiful daughter-in-law slid back into place. I felt the shift in the air, a sudden electricity of panic that made the hair on my neck stand up. Leona's shoulder lunged into my peripheral vision, her tray tilting precariously as she let out a choked sound, her body moving with a sudden, uncharacteristic desperation toward my arm. The crash of silver against mahogany was louder than a gunshot in the stifling silence of my study. Leona Ross did not just stumble. She lunged with a sudden desperate violence that sent her heavy silver serving tray catching my elbow with enough force to jar my entire frame. The teacup, that delicate vessel of cloying sweetness I had been seconds away from draining, slipped from my fingers. I watched it tumble in a slow-motion arc, amber liquid splashing across the $31 million succession contracts, like a spreading stain of betrayal. The damp texture of the succession papers warped instantly under the heat. "Oh, Mr. Garrison, I am so terribly sorry." Leona gasped, her voice thick with a terror she could barely mask as a clumsy apology. My hand, it just gave way. In the frantic rush that followed, she managed to knock the remaining cups into a chaotic cluster on the sideboard. It was a deliberate shell game, played with porcelain and poison, a frantic reshuffling that happened while Merritt and Lillian were still processing the shock of the noise. I realized then that Leona's clumsiness was a highly calculated intervention, a primal effort to prevent my immediate death. I watched her eyes wide wet with a desperate fear as she leaned over to blot the table. Under the cover of the clattering silver, I heard her whisper a single jagged word: "Don't. Leona, for God's sake." Merritt's voice tore through the room, his VP of Finance persona evaporating into a snarl of pure vitriol. "Those papers are worth more than your life." He scrambled to pick up the sodden documents, his hands shaking as he tried to shake off the herbal drench. Lillian, her perfectionist mask slipping into a mirror of her husband's irritation, pushed Leona aside with a cold, sharp shove to salvage the situation. Trust is like a pane of glass. You don't notice it's there until it's shattered, and then the shards cut everything they touch. I sat back in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs, like a trapped bird, realizing that the glass between me and my family had just turned into a weapon. The room was heavy with the scent of spilled herbal tea, an aroma that felt increasingly like a funeral shroud. Lillian was visibly rattling, her controlled grace replaced by a frantic, jagged energy as she tried to reorganize the mess. "Everything is a mess," she snapped, grabbing a linen napkin to dab at her silk skirt. "Merritt, help me with these linens." She paused, her breath coming in short, shallow hitches. "I just need a moment," she muttered, her hand reaching toward the cluster of cups Leona had scrambled. "This tea is the only thing keeping me sane right now." The room felt suddenly cold, as if the Highland Park sun had been blotted out by an invisible eclipse. I watched my tongue a lead weight of frozen observation as Lillian grabbed the only cup left standing in the center, the one she clearly believed was her own safe, unadulterated tea. I said nothing. I couldn't. I watched as my daughter-in-law raised the cup to her lips, and in her desperate need to calm her nerves, drained it to the very dregs. The irony was a physical weight in the air. Lillian, the architect of the poisoning, had just consumed the lethal dose intended for me. She set the cup down with a soft, final click, her pupils beginning to pinprick with an unnatural constriction as she wiped a lingering drop of sweetness from her lip. Lillian reached for the mahogany table, her manicured nails screeching against the polished wood as if trying to catch a sliding world. The soft click of the cup she had just set down was the last moment of normalcy I would ever know in that house. The transition from irritation to agony was instantaneous. Her face, usually a masterpiece of cosmetic perfection, contorted into a mask of pure shock before the first spasm hit. My daughter-in-law's body stiffened with a terrifying rigidity, her back arching so violently that she knocked her chair backward onto the thick Persian rug. A low, guttural sound escaped her throat, a rattle that seemed to vibrate the very air in the study. Her eyes rolled back, leaving only the whites visible as her jaw locked in a silent scream. I stood paralyzed by the sight of the poison intended for me, ravaging the woman who had smiled while serving it just moments before. As she seized Lillian's arm, flailed, and for a second, her fingers clawed toward the tea tray, a desperate, dying accusation. But my son Merritt moved with a grace that felt entirely too rehearsed. He stepped directly into her line of sight, blocking my view, and effectively silencing her before she could point or utter a single syllable of truth. Merit. What is happening? I managed to croak my voice, sounding like it belonged to another man. Lillian, Lillian, move her onto her side, I shouted, as the reality of the collapse finally punctured my shock. Leona, help me. The room descended into a chaotic swirl of motion. The smell of ozone from some electrical short in the air mingled with the cloying medicinal scent of that spilled tea. Benevolence is a shield I have worn for 70 years, but tonight it felt like a burial shroud. I watched my housekeeper, Leona Ross, rush forward, her face a map of absolute horror, though she avoided looking at the tea tray entirely. Within minutes, the heavy silence of Highland Park was shattered by the rhythmic wail of sirens. Blue and red flashing lights danced against the mahogany walls of my study, making the room look like it was bleeding. Paramedics burst through the front doors, their heavy equipment clattering against the marble floor as they swarmed over Lillian's prone form. My focus, however, narrowed to my son. Merritt stood by the window, his smartphone in hand, the cold click of the screen punctuating the chaos. He didn't look at his wife with grief or even fear. He looked at her with the cold annoyance of a man whose business deal had been delayed by a minor technicality. Have you ever seen the exact moment a man chooses a dollar sign over a soul? It does not look like a movie. It looks like silence. Dad, we need to handle the press. Merritt whispered, his thumb hovering over his phone. This cannot leak before the audit. I looked at him, looked at him, and realized the boy I had raised was a stranger. Your wife is dying, Merritt. I said, my voice cold and hollow. The press does not matter. He didn't even flinch. I spotted his thumb hovering over a send button on his screen. He wasn't calling a doctor or an update for the family. He was communicating with someone else about the interruption to our meeting. As the stretcher disappeared into the ambulance, Merritt did not follow. He turned back toward the study, his eyes already searching for the unsigned contracts scattered on my desk. The sliding glass doors of the UT Southwestern ER hissed shut behind me, sealing out the Dallas heat and replacing it with the sterile, recirculated air of a place where secrets go to die. I followed the frantic motion of the gurney, but my mind was stuck in the study back at Highland Park, replaying the way Merritt had looked at the unsigned contracts, while his wife's body was still cooling on the Persian rug. He hadn't come in the ambulance with her. He had followed in his own car, and even now, I realized my son wasn't just searching for lost paperwork. He was already notifying his lawyers to prepare a defense for an unfortunate accident before Lillian had even been wheeled into a trauma bay. I sat in the waiting area, my tailored wool suit feeling like a lead weight against the orange plastic of a chair that had seen too much grief. The smell of industrial floor wax was thick, cloying enough to rival the scent of that herbal tea. Merritt finally arrived, but he chose to pace the far end of the hallway, a safe distance from me. His thumbs danced over his phone screen with a frantic energy that had nothing to do with a husband's concern. I watched him through the dusty reflection in the vending machine glass, noting how he avoided the eyes of every passing nurse, as if they could read the guilt written in his very marrow. He was building a wall brick by digital brick. They are doing everything they can, Merritt, I said, as he paced near enough for my voice to carry. You should sit. He didn't even look at me. I can't sit, Dad. I need to call the legal team. If this gets out before we finalize the succession, the stock will plummet. Is it a sin to look at your own flesh and blood and hope the doctor finds a reason to put him in chains? I wondered if I had ever truly known the man I called my son, or if I had spent 44 years loving a mask of my own design. The fluorescent light overhead began to flicker, with a rhythmic, maddening pulse casting jagged shadows across the tile. Doctor Vance, an ER physician in her late 40s, with a sharp, clinical gaze and a badge that rattled against her stethoscope, approached me with a grim focus. She didn't head for Merritt. She walked straight toward me, her gait purposeful and heavy. Mr. Garrison, I'm Dr. Vance. We've stabilized your daughter-in-law, but her labs are... concerning. Suspicion is a slow-acting acid. It doesn't destroy the structure all at once. It eats the joints until the whole building collapses under its own weight. I felt that acid burning in my throat as I stood to meet her. Concerning, I asked, my voice a gravely whisper. What exactly did she ingest, Doctor? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she signaled a nurse who was pushing a rattling cart. I felt the cold sting of a needle as they insisted on a blood draw right there in the hallway. Doctor, Vance asked if I had consumed anything Lillian had prepared lately, her eyes searching mine for symptoms I hadn't yet named. She revealed that Lillian's condition wasn't a simple allergic reaction or food poisoning. The symptoms were indicative of a lethal chemical usually found in automotive maintenance. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the hospital hum. Mr. Garrison, this isn't food poisoning. We've found high levels of ethylene glycol, antifreeze. The silence in the small consult room was absolute, broken only by the clinical persistent hum of a computer fan. I stared at the computer monitor, watching a digital graph of my own blood chemistry transform into a map of a cold-blooded assassination attempt. Doctor, Vance sat across from me, her sharp features softened by a flicker of professional pity that I found more insulting than the diagnosis itself. She explained that while Lillian had suffered an acute massive dose of ethylene glycol, my own laboratory results revealed a far more insidious narrative. My calcium oxalate levels were elevated, and my kidney markers were trending toward disaster, indicating chronic low-dose exposure. This sweet death had been carefully modulated, titrated with enough precision to peak exactly on the day of the succession meeting. It was designed to ensure I would likely suffer a heart attack under the perceived stress of the signing, or perhaps succumb to a sudden, inexplicable kidney failure that would evade the suspicion of standard medical examiners. I felt the blood drain from my face as the coldness in my fingertips spread toward my chest. My brain fog wasn't a symptom of 71 years of life. It was a premeditated chemical erasure. You have been ingesting this for months, Thane, Doctor, Vance said, her voice dropping as she leaned toward me. Not weeks, months. I looked at the blue tint of the lab result screen, the dry antiseptic smell of the room suddenly feeling like the atmosphere of a tomb. How much longer did I have? I managed to ask, my voice a gravely whisper. Have you ever found out your life was a countdown timer, and the people holding the clock were the ones you were leaving everything to? The doctor didn't answer immediately, her silence confirming my darkest fears. She traced the timeline back to early May, noting a gradual spike in toxicity that correlated perfectly with the medical history of fatigue and nausea I had been complaining about. I mentally scanned the calendar: May, June, July, remembering every morning health tea Lillian had brought to my bedside with a warm kiss on my forehead. My mind fixed on the cruel math of the betrayal. 5 months of breakfast conversations and business planning, all while they watched me die one sip at a time. 5 months. 150 days of liquid treason. Dr. Vance began discussing the urgent need for chelation therapy to save my kidneys, mentioning that they were on the brink of permanent failure. A distant sound of a code being called over the hospital intercom drifted into the room, but I barely heard it. I was thinking about the specialist Merritt had insisted I see. Back in June, a man who had dismissed my symptoms as mere executive stress. I realized with a jolt of calculating rage that the man had likely been in on the plot, a paid actor in my son's long game. I looked through the glass partition at Merritt, who was still pacing in the hallway like a hungry wolf. He wasn't waiting for a miracle or a recovery. He wasn't even waiting for his wife to wake up. He was waiting for a death certificate and a clear path to the throne I had built for him. I sat perfectly still, the profound grief finally hardening into something lethal and focused. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a man who had found the exit to his own maze, and I was going to make sure the people who put me there never found theirs. Memory is a treacherous thing. It paints over the red flags with the warm colors of a home you thought was safe. Standing in that sterile consult room, the fluorescent buzz overhead pulled me back to a bright Tuesday in mid-May. The sun had been drenching my breakfast nook in Highland Park, casting a golden glow over the white linen and the silver service. Lillian had entered with a grace that seemed more rehearsed than natural, carrying a small porcelain tray. She insisted that my morning coffee was too harsh for my 71-year-old constitution, and introduced her special herbal blend from some boutique apothecary she claimed to have discovered in the city. I remember the way the sunlight caught the rising steam, making the liquid look like molten gold. As she set the cup down, she tucked a stray hair behind her ear and watched me take the first sip with an intensity I mistook for affection. I noticed then that she was holding a small, unlabeled vial, partially obscured behind her back. But I dismissed it as a simple sweetener, or perhaps a supplement she'd already added. "You are the pillar of this family, Thane," she had whispered. "We need to keep that heart of yours strong." I recall the clink of the silver spoon on the porcelain, a sound that felt like domestic harmony at the time. "It is a bit sweet, Lillian," I told her. "What exactly is in this?" She merely smiled, telling me it was a gift of love, a way to ensure I would be around to see my grandchildren take over the company. Trust is a blindfold we choose to wear because the light of the truth is too blinding to face. I wore that blindfold proudly, ignoring the faint scent of honeysuckle and something sharper, more metallic, that lurked beneath the herbs. By noon that same day, the world had started to tilt on its axis. I recall sitting in a board meeting at Garrison Land Holdings, the numbers on the projection screen blurring into gray smudges while a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. A wave of nausea rolled through my gut, making the spreadsheets look like a drowning man's last view of the surface. I blamed it on the dry-aged steak from the night before, never once suspecting the beautiful woman who had kissed my cheek as I left. I found myself later in my study rubbing my temples in the dim light, feeling a profound exhaustion. Merritt found me there, but instead of calling a doctor, he merely reinforced the narrative Lillian had begun. "It is just the stress of the succession talks, Dad," he'd said, with a dismissive wave. "Drink more of Lillian's tea. It's designed to settle the nerves. A predator doesn't always growl. Sometimes it smiles and brings you a tray." "I feel dim, Merritt," I told him, "like the lights are turned down." He had nodded already, looking at his watch, and I realized now that he had been the one to suggest she start taking care of my nutrition in the first place. The sun was the architect of my slow-motion murder from the very first day. The image of Lillian's smiling face in the sunlight shattered, replaced by the clinical blue-white glare of the hospital room where the poison in my blood now had a name. I sat there, the vengeful clarity of the present moment cutting through the ghosts of May like a surgeon's blade. I ignored Merritt's questions in the hallway, my footsteps heavy as I searched for the only person in the hospital who had looked at me with fear instead of pity. The clinical blue-white glare of the emergency wing seemed to vibrate against my skin, a cold reminder of the anti-freeze now mapped out in my own veins. I walked past the vending machines and the rows of plastic chairs, heading toward the quietest corner of the hospital. I found Leona Ross sitting in the back pew of the hospital chapel, her rosary beads white-knuckled in her lap. The rough texture of the beads was the only thing grounding her as she sat in the flickering light of the prayer candles. She did not look up as I slid into the seat beside her, the scent of beeswax and cold stone momentarily dulling the hospital's sharp antiseptic bite. For 20 years she had been a shadow in my home, the quiet force that kept the Highland Park estate running. But today I saw her for what she truly was. "You saved me today, Leona." I whispered, my voice a gravely rasp in the hallowed silence. She finally looked at me, her eyes wet and bloodshot. "I have been praying you would come here, Mr. Garrison. I did not know if I could keep the secret any longer." She admitted then that she had been doing more than just watching. For the past 3 weeks, she had been finding excuses to take my half-empty cups back to the kitchen, intentionally diluting the remaining tea with hot water before Lillian could serve me a fresh pot. She had been keeping me alive just long enough for the truth to catch up to the lies. A home is supposed to be a fortress, but I had spent 30 years fortifying a den of vipers. I realized that while I was busy building an empire of land and holdings, I had been blind to the war being waged in my own breakfast nook. Leona reached into the deep pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small, spiral-bound notebook with Garrison estate supplies written on the cover. I watched her weathered hands, the hands that had served me thousands of meals, and felt a wave of shame for never truly seeing the woman behind the service. She had been the only pillar of truth I had left. Her thumb stroked the worn cardboard, her knuckles white with the terror of what Merritt might do if he found her with this hidden ledger. Have you ever looked at a simple notebook and realized it was the only thing standing between you and a shallow grave? I waited, the chapel silence magnifying her shaky exhale as she finally flipped the cover open to show me the first entry. I started writing things down in May, she said, her voice a brittle thread. Just little things at first. Conversations I overheard when I was dusting the hallway or clearing the silver. Show me Leona, I insisted. I need to see it all. The sound of the spiral notebook's wire binding scratching against her sleeve was the only sound in the room as she turned to the very first page. I expected to see notes about the tea or the vials, but the entry was far more devastating. The blue ink on the first page was smudged, but the words were clear. May 10th. Merritt said the old man is living on borrowed time. It was a recorded fragment of a conversation between my son and his wife dated weeks before the first symptoms even appeared. The flickering prayer candles in the chapel cast long dancing shadows, but they were nothing compared to the darkness Leona described lurking in my own kitchen 4 months ago. I sat in the heavy silence staring at the blue ink of her notebook while she recounted a humid morning in late September. She had been emptying the trash in my study move by move, a routine task that suddenly turned into a discovery of a map to my own grave. Among the discarded investor reports and crumpled drafts of succession plans, she found several sheets of paper covered in highlighted medical text. She described the crinkle of scavenged paper as she pulled them out, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. There were detailed descriptions of end-stage renal failure and the specific chemical properties of ethylene glycol. I saw the words lethal dose circled in red ink. Mr. Garrison. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of burning beeswax. It wasn't a mistake. Someone was studying how to dismantle you. Why didn't you bring those papers to me then? Leona, I asked, a wave of sickening realization washing over me. Because I found out they came from Merritt's private office computer. She said, her eyes meeting mine with a pained intensity. Not Lillian's. Your own son was the one doing the research. Before she could even process the horror of what she held, a shadow had fallen across the study doorway. Lillian Palmer had appeared, her eyes scanning the room with a predator's cold precision. Lillian's charm was a thin layer of gold leaf over a lead heart. Beautiful to look at, but toxic to the touch. Leona had stuffed the papers under her apron, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the plastic trash bin to steady herself. Lillian didn't say a word then, but minutes later she cornered Leona in the kitchen near the cold hum of the industrial refrigerator. The loving daughter-in-law mask was gone, replaced by a murderous intensity that made the air in the room feel thin and frozen. How do you protect a man who is being dismantled by the people he loves in the house you've served for 20 years? Leona had no answer then. Lillian grabbed her wrist. Her grip like iron, the pressure forcing Leona's fingers to go numb. You're a very old woman, Leona, Lillian had whispered, her face inches away. It would be so easy for you to have a fall, just like Thane is about to have. I was just doing my job, Mrs. Garrison. Leona had stammered, terrified that the research papers would slip from her apron. I didn't see anything. But Lillian wasn't finished. She revealed she knew about Leona's daughter and her past struggles, threatening to use Merritt's legal influence and wealth to ruin the girl's career and life if Leona ever breathed a word of what she suspected. Lillian leaned in so close. Leona could smell the expensive mint on her breath an aroma that would forever be associated with a death threat. She hissed a final warning that stopped the blood in Leona's veins. "If he doesn't die of the tea, Leona, you'll be the one to go first." I looked at the weathered woman sitting beside me in the chapel and felt a debt that no amount of garrison money could ever truly repay. She had lived in a state of constant whispered terror for months, all to keep a drop of tea from being my last. Leona's hand shook as she pulled a burner phone from the lining of her cardigan, the small screen glowing like a coal in the chapel's dim light. I leaned in the cold hardness of the wooden pew, biting into my spine as she navigated to a saved audio file. The recording began with the hollow metallic echo of my own kitchen, a place I once associated with the safety of family breakfasts. Now it was a crime scene captured in real time. Lillian's voice came through first sharp and clinical, discussing the final dose of antifreeze needed to trigger my kidney failure without alerting the coroner. "It has to be the morning of the meeting." Merritt, she said, her tone as casual as if she were ordering groceries. "The stress will mask the initial nausea. One more week of the tea, and he will be too weak to fight the succession transfer." I felt the air in the chapel turn to ice. This woman whom I had welcomed into my home and family was describing my impending death as a tedious technical chore. The recording revealed a depth of calculation that made my skin crawl. Merritt was actually the lead, specifying the use of ethylene glycol because he knew my medical records already showed minor kidney stones from years ago. He was counting on the doctors to see what they expected, to see an old man finally failing. Do you know what it sounds like when the person you gave life to decides yours is worth exactly $10.5 million? It sounds like static. The crackle of the low-quality audio file filled the space between me and Leona, drowning out the distant rhythmic drip of a hospital IV somewhere nearby. Then the voice I had loved for 44 years entered the conversation. Merritt did not sound hesitant or coerced. He sounded impatient, his heartbeat's steady laugh cutting through the room like a serrated blade. He asked if the insurance policy was ironclad, chuckling when Lillian mentioned how easy it was to manipulate the old man. "He thinks he is building a legacy." Merritt said, his voice dripping with a casual, predatory arrogance. "He is just building my bank account. Make sure the sweet tea is extra sugary that morning. I do not want him tasting the additive." Hearing my only son refer to me as a hurdle to be cleared for a payout broke something inside me that may never be mended. My son. My only son. My executioner. My grief was deep and soul-crushing, but beneath it a new, jagged resolve began to harden. Leona watched me, her eyes wet with shared pain, as the recording captured the final, sickening clink of glasses as they toasted to a future bought with my blood. The audio cut to a separate, shorter clip, where Merritt's voice became even more hurried. He admitted to Lillian that he had been systematically stealing from the garrison landholdings accounts for years, not months, and that my death was the only way to bury the paper trail forever. The red flags I had ignored were not just mistakes. They were the scaffolding of my own gallows. The recording hissed into silence, but the last word Merritt spoke, succession, hung in the chapel air like a curse. I sat there in the blue glow of the phone screen, the silence of the chapel finally matching the absolute frozen calm that had taken root in my chest. Leona Ross looked at me with a look of ancient gratitude as she tucked the burner phone back into the deep lining of her cardigan. The recording had hissed into silence, but the last word Merritt spoke, succession, hung in the chapel air like a curse. I looked at Leona, really looked at her, and realized that while my own blood was plotting to bury me, a woman I'd treated as part of the furniture had spent 20 years waiting for the chance to save my life. She sat there surrounded by the smell of old hymnals and cold stone and began to speak of a debt I had forgotten. Leona explained that she had actually quit her previous job to work for me, specifically to watch over me long before she knew any plot existed. It went back to the year 2005. She reminded me of a year when her daughter was diagnosed with stage 3 neuroblastoma. I remembered the charity foundation I'd set up, but I hadn't realized that the $580,000 bill for the experimental treatment was paid to her daughter's surgeons anonymously by me. She had discovered it only by accident years later through a stray accounting ledger. "You didn't just pay a bill, Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice trembling. "You gave my daughter her wedding day. You gave me my grandchildren." I realized then that her surveillance wasn't born of nosiness, but of a fierce, protective debt. She couldn't allow the man who saved her child to be erased by the greed of his own. I was floored by the realization that a forgotten act of business expense charity had become my ultimate insurance policy. How many times had I passed her in the hallway, offering a polite nod, while she carried the weight of my entire survival in her apron pocket? I felt a profound, humbling connection to this woman, a bond forged in a history I had treated as a line item on a tax return. The heavy oak doors of the chapel swung open, and a woman entered. Detective Simone Reyes, a seasoned 52-year-old investigator with the Dallas PD, walked into the hospital chapel with her badge catching the dim light. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the stone floor, a sharp, authoritative sound that broke the spell of the candlelight. She wore a vibrant blue suit that looked strikingly out of place against the somber church benches. She looked at the burner phone in Leona's hand, and the look of cold iron in my eyes, immediately sensing that this was no longer a simple medical inquiry. The badge on Reyes's belt caught the light. The game of tea and smiles was over. "Mr. Garrison, I'm Detective Reyes. The ER physician mentioned some irregularities in your tox screen." I stood to meet her, the wisdom of 71 years coalescing into a single sharp intent. "Irregularities is a polite word for murder, detective," I replied. "We have much to discuss." Reyes didn't just come because of the hospital call. She revealed she had been tracking Lillian under a different name for a series of suspicious deaths in other states. She took my phone, looking at the photo of my daughter-in-law on my lock screen, and narrowed her eyes with a chilling recognition. "That's not Lillian Palmer, Mr. Garrison," she whispered. "That's a ghost we've been chasing since Arizona." I walked from the chapel back toward the main hospital wing, following the steady, authoritative click of Detective Reyes's heels on the tile. The shock of her revelation about Lillian hung over me like a heavy mist. But as we walked, my mind drifted back to the moment the internal alarms first sounded. A man who has spent 44 years developing real estate learns to trust the foundations, but my own body was telling me that the soil beneath my feet had turned to poison. It was a Tuesday in mid-September when I woke up with a copper-heavy metallic taste coating my tongue, thick enough that I could almost feel the weight of it. I sat on the edge of my bed in Highland Park, the luxury of the room suddenly feeling like a gilded cage. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a byproduct of the heart medication Merritt had insisted I take, claiming the cardiologist was worried about my palpitations. "Thane, you are just working too hard," I told the man in the mirror, knowing even then it was a desperate lie. "The fog isn't in my head," I whispered to the empty room. "It is in the cup." My business instincts, the same ones that had spotted bad deals and structural cracks a mile away, finally turned their cold, analytical lens toward my own family. It was a sickening transition from father to investigator. I looked at the morning sunlight hitting my mahogany nightstand and felt an icy clarity. I was being dismantled from the inside out, piece by piece, by the people who called me dad and darling. Do you know what it feels like to pay $10,000 to have strangers hide cameras in your own bedroom so you can watch your son betray you? It is a specialized kind of grief that tastes of shame and necessity. Without telling a soul, I contacted a high-end private security firm under the guise of upgrading the estate's technological assets. They arrived on a night when Merritt and Lillian were at a charity gala, moving with the efficiency of ghosts. I felt the cool mahogany texture of the moldings as they installed pinhole lenses that were virtually invisible to the naked eye. They worked in the vents behind the books in the study and near the kitchen island. I watched them wire the feed to an encrypted server hidden in a false wall, feeling like a spy in my own home. I wanted total coverage, I told the lead technician. High definition. Audio included. Especially the study. He assured me that discretion was their specialty and that my family would never know they were there. The smell of new electrical wiring and the faint, constant hum of the hidden server became the new background noise of my life. The red light on the server flickered. The hunt had begun. As the security team was packing up, one of the technicians paused, staring at a framed photo of Lillian on the hallway table. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he recognized her from a high-stakes security job he'd done in Phoenix years ago. He seemed confused, noting that back then her name had been something entirely different. The revelation sat in my gut like lead. As the team finally left, I sat in the darkness of my study, the cold glow of a tablet screen illuminating my face. The first live feed appeared, and my heart stopped as I watched Lillian entering the kitchen with a small, clear bottle in her hand. The first night of recorded footage on my tablet had been enough to freeze my blood. But the realization that I had to return to that house to retrieve the primary source felt like walking back into a crypt. I gripped the silver hard drive so tightly that its sharp edges bit into my palm, a small physical pain to ground me against the psychological wreckage of my son's betrayal. I returned to the Highland Park estate under the cover of a thick, swirling morning fog that made the limestone walls look like they were weeping. I moved like a ghost through the halls I had once walked with the pride of a man who had earned every square foot. Now the luxury was just a facade for a crime scene. I had taken extra precautions beyond just lenses. I had the security firm install a remote kill switch for the house's smart locks. If Merritt or Lillian tried to run, I could turn my own home into their prison with a single tap on my phone. I reached the library and accessed the hidden server tucked behind the false wall of leather-bound classics. The hum of the cooling fans sounded like the heartbeat of the house's secret guardian, the only entity in this building that wasn't lying to me. I transferred the last 3 weeks of footage onto an encrypted drive, my hands steady, despite the bile rising in my throat. Every megabyte that pulsed through the cable was another nail in the coffin of the man Merritt had become. "You built this house to be a sanctuary, Thane," I whispered to the shadows. "Now it is a witness. Copying 98%, 99%. Done." I pulled the drive and slipped it into my pocket. The cold bite of the metal a comfort. How do you tell a police officer that you've spent the last hour watching your only child discuss the best way to dispose of your remains? It is a question for which 44 years of business experience had not prepared me. By the time I reached Dallas Police Headquarters, the glare of the fluorescent precinct lights felt like an interrogation I was finally ready to face. The smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner replaced the scent of the morning fog. Detective Simone Reyes met me in the lobby, her expression unreadable and professional. I handed her the silver drive, the silent digital record of my own family's depravity. I explained the business instincts that had led me here, the metallic warning on my tongue, and the decision to hire professionals. She looked at me with a mix of professional respect and a deep human pity that made me want to look away. "Everything is on here, Detective," I said, my voice as cold as the drive itself. 3 weeks of high-definition footage, audio included. She nodded slowly, her fingers grazing the crinkle of an evidence bag as she tucked the drive inside. "You've done the hardest part, Mr. Garrison," she replied. "Let us handle the rest." The silver drive was cold, a digital iceberg that would sink their ship. As Reyes took the drive, she informed me of a new development that made my stomach churn with fresh disgust. Merritt had already been busy. He had filed a missing person report for Lillian, attempting to spin her emergency hospital stay as a kidnapping by me. He was already trying to weave a new lie before the old one had even unraveled. Reyes moved toward a private viewing room and gestured for me to follow. "Let's see what your son has been up to when he thought you weren't looking." The monitor flickered to life with a grainy blue tint, and suddenly I was a ghost in my own home, watching the people I loved most prepare for my funeral while I was still breathing. I sat in the cramped viewing room at Dallas Police Headquarters, the cold hum of the precinct air conditioning vibrating in my ears. Beside me, Detective Reyes watched the screen with a practiced, stony neutrality. The footage showed my study 3 days before the collapse. Lillian was clearly visible at my desk, her movements casual and fluid. She reached into a generic bag and pulled out a translucent automotive bottle, unscrewing the cap with a steady hand. I watched as she poured the liquid into my favorite tea tin, her face a mask of domestic boredom. Merritt stood by the door, not as a reluctant witness, but as a sentinel. He checked his watch with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl, his eyes darting toward the hallway. They weren't whispering like lovers caught in a moment of passion. They were discussing dosages like chemists calculating exactly how long my kidneys would last under the strain, just enough to keep him confused. Lillian Merritt's voice crackled through the tinny speakers. "We can't have him questioning the audit." "Don't worry, Merritt," she replied with a thin smile. "By Friday, he won't be able to read a spreadsheet, let alone an audit report." The most crushing part wasn't the chemical. It was the logistics. The video clearly showed Merritt retrieving that same automotive bottle from his own car trunk earlier that evening and handing it to her. He provided the weapon. The pixels didn't lie. My son was a monster. I felt a wave of nauseating betrayal wash over me, a cold clarity that burned worse than the ethylene glycol ever could. Have you ever heard a laugh that sounded like the lid of your own coffin slamming shut? I have. The final clip on the drive played the night before the accident. Merritt was sitting in my leather chair, the one I'd occupied for 44 years. He tilted his head back, mimicking the way I had been gasping for air in my state of fatigue. He contorted his face into a grotesque death mask, his tongue lolling slightly as he mocked my struggle. "Look at me, Lillian O. Merritt. The room is spinning." He let out a sharp, joyful laugh that echoed through the small room, a sound so jagged and devoid of humanity that I felt my soul shatter. Lillian joined in, leaning over the desk to stroke his hair as they toasted with wine glasses to the $10.5 million insurance payout. Merritt leaned forward, his face illuminated by the desk lamp. He admitted on tape that he'd been using my brain fog days to forge my signature on hundreds of thousands of dollars in unauthorized withdrawals. He treated my slow-motion murder as a punchline to a private joke, a necessary step to cover the holes he'd dug in my life's work. My son, my only son, my executioner. Detective Reyes reached forward, the sharp click of the pause button echoing in the silence. She froze the frame on Merritt's laughing face, his eyes cold and empty of anything resembling a human soul. She looked at me, her expression finally softening into something like genuine sorrow. "That's all the premeditation we need, Mr. Garrison," she said softly. "The evidence is irrefutable." Detective Reyes closed the laptop with a definitive click, her face tight with a new, grim urgency. I moved from the viewing room to the executive conference table with a heavy, rhythmic stride, my legs feeling stronger than they had in months now that the fog had lifted. Blood may be thicker than water, but in the world of high-stakes real estate, nothing is more cold-blooded than a balance sheet that doesn't add up. As I entered the boardroom, the smell of stale coffee and laser toner hung in the air, a scent I had always associated with progress now tainted by the stench of a crime scene. The accountant, a man named Miller, with skin the color of old parchment and eyes that saw only in binary, adjusted his spectacles as he dissected my ruin. He laid out a series of spreadsheets that showed Garrison Land Holdings had been hemorrhaging cash, $725,000 to be exact, over the last 8 months. I felt the coldness of the leather chair beneath me as Miller explained that Merritt had been using my brain fog days to authorize wire transfers to shell companies I had never heard of. Red ink bled across the page like a fresh wound. However, the cash wasn't the only casualty. I discovered that Merritt didn't just steal the liquidity. He had used the Highland Park estate, my own home, as collateral for a private loan I never authorized. He had leveraged my sanctuary to fuel his madness. Mr. Garrison, your son didn't just mismanage funds, Miller said, the dry slide of paper on the glass table sounding like a rasp. He executed a systematic liquidation. Cryptocurrency is the modern siren song. It promises a shore of gold, but leaves you broken on the rocks of a hard drive you can't unlock. The blue light glare of Miller's laptop screen illuminated the digital graveyard where my money had gone to die. Merritt had gambled the company's liquidity on high-leverage moonshot coins and a decentralized finance scam that had vanished overnight. He was chasing a ghost, trying to win back enough to cover his initial theft before the impending audit. He didn't just want me dead. He wanted me blamed for his failures. Miller traced the stolen funds through a labyrinth of offshore crypto wallets, but the path always led back to Merritt's greed. I saw the desperate logic of a man who decided it was easier to bury his father than to admit he had lost the crown jewels to a screen full of digital vapor. He lost it all, didn't he? I asked, the sudden heavy silence of the boardroom magnifying my gravelly voice. Worse than that, Miller replied. He was bankrupting you to pay for his vanity. The final blow came when Miller revealed that the November 1st audit was actually requested by Merritt himself. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, intended to pin the missing funds on my supposedly declining mental state once I was safely in the ground. Miller slid one final document across the table, a life insurance verification. This wasn't just about covering the theft, Mr. Garrison. This was about a $10.5 million jackpot. I stared at the document, the weight of the betrayal settling into a sharp, lethal clarity. My son hadn't just been waiting for my death. He had been betting on it with everything I had ever built. The weight of the insurance document Miller had slid across the table felt heavier than the $31 million it promised upon my death. I had welcomed a ghost into my home, a woman whose entire existence was a carefully curated lie designed to end mine. I was still reeling from the financial autopsy of my own company when FBI agent Miller, a man with the weary face of a professional hunter and a voice like dry gravel, laid out the evidence of my domestic nightmare. He spread several manila folders across the mahogany table, each one a tombstone for a different identity used by the woman I knew as Lillian. Mr. Garrison, Lillian doesn't exist. He said, his eyes locking onto mine with a clinical pity. You've been living with Laura Mitchell. She's a professional con artist and a suspected serial killer who specializes in targeting wealthy elderly men through their vulnerable family members. I listened numb and hollow as he explained that Laura hadn't been found by Merritt in some high society mixer. She had targeted my son first, hunting him in an underground gambling den in East Dallas. She knew his debts before he did, and she used him as her key to my front door. The woman who kissed my cheek every morning was a predator who had been perfecting this specific hunt for over a decade. I felt a sharp, metallic taste return to my mouth, a ghost of the poison she had fed me. How many others, I managed to ask, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. How many men has she done this to? Miller didn't answer with words. He answered with the gloss of high-resolution photos. He slid a series of crime scene and social media images toward me, and the air in the room suddenly felt thin and poisonous. I saw Laura, alias Lillian, standing beside a real estate mogul in Arizona who died of natural kidney failure in 2019. I saw her again, weeping artfully at the funeral of a casino owner in Nevada in 2021. The pearls, they weren't jewelry, they were a scorecard. In every single photo draped around her neck were the same graduated South Sea pearls I had bought her for her anniversary with Merritt. They were a recurring trophy of her kills, worn in plain sight as she moved from one slaughterhouse to the next. How do you breathe when you realize your own home has been a slaughterhouse in waiting? Miller continued, his rhythmic tapping on the table, a sound that felt like a countdown. He explained that Laura was a black widow who didn't just take the money. She took the life to ensure the silence remained permanent. But then he revealed a detail that felt like a jagged piece of cosmic justice. It turns out that in her haste and the chaos of our kitchen, Laura Mitchell had begun suffering from the early stages of the same kidney toxicity she had been giving me. It was an accidental self-poisoning, a bitter irony from her own special tea that she had likely ingested while masking her tracks. "My God," I whispered, staring at the gallery of victims. "She's wearing the pearls in all of them." Miller tapped a final photo, a hidden notebook found in Lillian's safe during a preliminary sweep. It was a list of targets. My name was at the top, written in her elegant script, but as my eyes traveled down the page, my heart stopped. My son's name was right beneath mine, marked with a date only 2 months away. I had barely processed the fact that my son was on a serial killer's target list when the phone on my desk rang, carrying the voice of a man who dealt only in the cold finality of death and premiums. I sat in the executive office of Garrison Land Holdings, the room smelling of expensive leather and dust, while the images of Laura Mitchell's previous victims still burned behind my eyelids. Arthur, my insurance agent of 30 years, spoke with a voice that usually sounded like comfort, but today it sounded like a death warrant. He sounded confused, his usual professional polish replaced by a stuttering urgency. "Thane, I'm calling because Merritt seemed—" "Well, he was quite insistent that we have the 10.5 million ready by Monday," Arthur said. I felt my grip tighten on my pen, the rhythmic tapping against my glass desk, stopping instantly. "He told you I was dying." Before the doctors even finished the tox screen. My voice was a gravelly whisper that seemed to disappear into the vacuum of the room. Arthur's silence was my answer. He revealed that Merritt had called the office less than 48 hours after Lillian's collapse, not to inquire about coverage for her medical bills, but to expedite the processing of my life insurance policy. He had claimed my death was imminent due to a sudden aggressive renal failure, the very diagnosis the antifreeze was designed to produce. But the cruelty went deeper. Arthur mentioned a consultation fee Merritt had already paid to a local funeral home 2 weeks before the tea incident in my study. My son had effectively pre-ordered my cremation before I had even felt the first pang of the final dose. Have you ever heard the price of your own soul quoted over a landline $10.5 million? Apparently that is where my son's love ended. I looked out at the cold Dallas skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the steel towers looking like jagged teeth against the gray sky. Arthur continued, his voice dropping, as he detailed a change made to the policy 8 months prior. Merritt had submitted paperwork listing Lillian Palmer as the secondary beneficiary and giving himself unrevocable power of attorney over the payout. I realized then that the signature on those forms was likely a perfect replica forged during one of my foggy spells. The dial tone was the only honest thing left in the building. Merritt hadn't just wanted the inheritance. He wanted the liquidity immediately to cover the $700,000 hole he'd gambled away in the crypto markets. He had built a machine to grind me into a profit margin, and he was using my own resources to fuel it. "Arthur," I said, my voice finally finding its edge. "Freeze the policy. Now. Do not let a single cent move." He told me then that Merritt had used my own signature stamped from a device he'd seen Merritt use before to authorize the payout expedition. I sat in my high-backed chair, the weight of 71 years, feeling like a suit of armor rather than a burden. I stood up the chair, rolling back with a sharp, piercing screech on the hardwood. It was time for the old man to show his son exactly why he had built an empire in the first place. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the primary obstacle, and I was about to become Merritt's greatest mistake. The morning of October 20th arrived with a sterile cutting clarity. I stood at the head of the boardroom table, the morning sun glinting off the Dallas skyscrapers behind me, looking at my son and seeing nothing but a predatory stranger waiting for me to stop breathing. I had built this empire, Garrison Land Holdings, from the dirt up, but today it was nothing more than a cage I had spent days carefully baiting. Merritt entered the room with a practiced air of confidence, his expensive cologne failing to mask the faint metallic scent of fear I could now perceive with agonizing sharpness. He slid a final set of urgent papers toward me, his hand steady, or so he thought. "Just one more signature, Dad," he said, his voice a smooth silk over a jagged edge. "For the legacy." I maintained my foggy persona, letting my hand tremble slightly as I hovered the pen over the documents. He didn't realize that the papers he'd just handed me weren't the transfer of assets he'd drafted. They were a detailed confession of financial irregularities and self-dealing I had prepared in secret. In his frantic haste to secure the $10.5 million payout, my son signed his own downfall without reading a single line. I watched him flourish his pen, the same instrument he had used to forge my death warrant, before the heavy oak doors were kicked open by the Dallas PD. "Merritt Garrison, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree attempted murder," Detective Simone Reyes declared, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the board members like a guillotine. The look of smug triumph on Merritt's face curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The click of the handcuffs was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 5 months. It was the sound of a lid closing on a coffin, but this time I wasn't the one inside. My peers' men I had known for decades watched in a vacuum of silence as my only son was forced away from the table. Simultaneously, miles away at UT Southwestern, a tactical team entered the recovery wing, where Lillian, now identified as Laura Mitchell, was being prepared for discharge. She tried to maintain her grieving wife act, but the sight of FBI Agent Miller and the cold click of steel on her wrists shattered her carefully curated composure. Do you know what it's like to watch your own child be perp-walked through the lobby of your life's work? It feels like a funeral where the deceased is the only one standing. My phone vibrated with a confirmation text from Reyes just as Merritt was marched through the glass-walled lobby below. His suit jacket was pulled over his head to hide from the media cameras already gathering like vultures. In a final act of desperation, he screamed that Lillian had forced him into it, his voice echoing off the marble floors. He had no way of knowing that at that very moment Laura Mitchell was telling Agent Miller that Merritt was the sole architect of the plot, claiming she was merely a victim of his greed. The game of tea and smiles had ended in a mutual betrayal. As the elevator doors closed on Merritt's tear-streaked face, I realized that for the first time in years, the metallic taste in my mouth was gone, replaced by the bitter, cold ash of a burnt-down bridge. I stood alone in my boardroom, a survivor of my own legacy. The December wind whipped through Dealey Plaza, carrying a winter chill that felt warmer than the look my only son gave me from across the courtroom aisle. Standing outside the Frank Crowley Courts building, I pulled my wool coat tighter, a physical shield against the biting Dallas air and the swarm of media cameras. The metallic taste that had haunted me for months was long gone, but the ash of that burnt bridge remained dry and suffocating in my throat. I walked into the Dallas County Criminal Court, my tailored coat, feeling like a suit of armor against the sea of reporters and sketch artists, hungry for a glimpse of the Garrison Fall. The room smelled of old court transcripts and floor wax, a dry, dusty scent that offered no comfort. Merritt sat at the defense table, his expensive suit, the very one I had bought him for his last birthday, hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to have withered in the confines of a cell. He avoided my gaze, staring instead at the scarred wood of the table. Beside him sat Lillian, the woman the world now knew as Laura Mitchell. She had survived the lethal dose through emergency medical intervention at UT Southwestern, where doctors had worked around the clock to save the very woman who had been poisoning me for months. The irony was not lost on anyone in that courtroom. Lillian had spent weeks in intensive care, her kidneys damaged by the same antifreeze she had administered to me. But modern medicine had pulled her back from the edge she had prepared for me. Now recovered enough to stand trial, but still bearing the physical scars of her own poison. She sat in an orange jumpsuit with a serene mask of innocence that would have fooled me just 2 months ago. I took my seat in the front row of the gallery, the cold hardness of the wooden bench, a grounding reminder of the reality I had fought to uncover. I was not there for revenge. I was there for the truth that 44 years of fatherhood had apparently failed to cultivate. I felt a surge of cold resolve as the judge called the session to order. However, that resolve was tested the moment the defense began their opening remarks. I realized with a sick jolt that Merritt's legal team was planning to argue that I suffered from early-onset dementia. They intended to claim I had imagined the surveillance footage or staged it in a fit of paranoid delusion, despite the crystal-clear, high-definition quality of the recordings. Have you ever sat in a room full of strangers and waited for them to watch a video of your son celebrating your death? The lead prosecutor stood, her voice steady and sharp, as she addressed the 12 strangers who held my family's fate in their hands. She didn't waste time with flowery speeches. She spoke of anti-freeze crypto debts and a son who valued a payout more than a pulse. She walked to the large screen at the front of the room, the blue-white glare of the monitor illuminating the pained faces of the jury. "Watch closely, ladies and gentlemen," she said, her hand hovering over the remote. "This is the sound of greed." The lights dimmed. The screen glowed. My heart stopped. The hum of the projector was the only sound in the suffocating silence as the footage began to play. The prosecution had unearthed a segment I hadn't even viewed yet. On the screen, Merritt leaned back in my leather chair, a glass of wine in his hand. "I've already picked out the headstone," he told Lillian with a casual shrug. "Granite. Something heavy, so the old man can't climb back out." The courtroom gasps were audible, a collective intake of breath that matched my own. Merritt's recorded laughter then filled the room, jagged and joyful, echoing off the high ceilings, as the jury watched him mimic the gasping, labored breaths of my final moments. I sat perfectly still, a hollow man, watching the ghost of a son I never truly knew. The echoes of Merritt's taped laughter were still vibrating in the courtroom rafters when the prosecution called Dr. Eris Thorne, a forensic toxicologist with silver hair and a voice that cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. He adjusted his glasses as he prepared to dismantle the defense, his clinical gaze making the courtroom feel like a cold morgue, even before he opened his black briefcase. I sat in my gallery seat, a hollowness in my chest that no scientific explanation could fill, yet I hung on every word. "Doctor." Thorne pulled a series of chemical diagrams from his files, the dry paper-cut sound of court documents cutting through the heavy silence. He displayed the molecular structure of ethylene glycol, explaining with a chilling detachment how the substance transforms into jagged crystals inside human kidneys. Science is a cold mirror. It doesn't care about the name on the birth certificate, only the atoms left in the blood. He pointed to a photo of an anti-freeze bottle recovered from Lillian's desk and compared its specific bittering agent to the residue found in my vintage tea tins. "The patient wasn't aging, Doctor," Thorne testified, his finger tapping the diagram with the screech of chalk on a board. "He was being petrified from the inside out. This wasn't an accident, Your Honor. It was a titration of death." I watched the jury's faces turn from confusion to a sickened clarity as they realized my morning ritual was actually a slow-motion execution. The scientific horror of it all felt like a physical weight pinning me to the wooden bench. My own flesh and blood had been counting the crystals. The atmosphere shifted from clinical to visceral as the next witness was called. Brandon, a 35-year-old ex-con, with a face mapped by hard choices and eyes full of a strange, fierce loyalty, walked to the stand with a heavy tread. I remembered him from a decade ago. I had paid for the surgery that saved his life after a workplace accident when no one else would. I discovered in that moment that my survival had been a collective effort of those I had helped. Brandon didn't just warn Leona Ross. He was the one who had provided the high-end pinhole cameras I used, acting as a secret guardian for months. Have you ever found out that your life was saved by a man you'd forgotten? While being hunted by the man you'd given everything to, Brandon's voice had a jagged edge as he described how Lillian, under her Laura Mitchell alias, had approached him to stage a reckless driving incident for me. She wanted it to look messy and profitable, he testified, glancing briefly at me with a nod of respect. I couldn't kill the man who gave me a second chance, so I gave him one instead. Merritt's lawyer lunged to his feet with an objection, but the judge overruled him. Her eyes fixed on Brandon. The ex-con leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. He revealed the final, most desperate layer of the plot. Brandon testified that Merritt had personally offered him a substantial cash bonus to ensure my body was cremated immediately after the staged accident. The goal was to incinerate any trace of the toxins that had already begun to accumulate in my system. Brandon pointed a scarred finger directly at Merritt and whispered, "He didn't just want the money. He wanted to make sure there was no evidence left to bury." Leona Ross walked to the witness stand, not with the gait of a housekeeper, but with the measured, heavy tread of a woman who had spent 5 months carrying the weight of my survival in her apron pocket. The rustle of her navy dress was the only sound in the courtroom. As she took the oath, her eyes briefly meeting mine with a flicker of ancient, shared understanding. She didn't look at Merritt, who sat just a few feet away, his face a pale mask of anxiety. Leona began to detail the agonizing 5 months of secret surveillance, her voice trembling, as she described seeing Lillian add an unlabeled sweetener to my morning tea. She produced the small spiral notebook I had seen in the chapel, the scratchy sound of the pages turning amplified by the courtroom microphones. She read aloud the dates and my corresponding symptoms, the dizziness that began in June, the tremors that gripped my hands in August. I watched the jury hang on her every word, their expressions shifting from skepticism to a deep, visceral shock. Loyalty isn't a paycheck. It's a debt of the soul that never carries interest, only gravity. I realized that while I had treated her as part of the architecture of my life for 20 years, she had been my silent sentinel guarding me against the predators I had raised. She even revealed that she had contacted my son's childhood nanny, discovering a long history of cold, calculated cruelty that I had willfully ignored in my pursuit of a legacy. Before I show you why Leona risked everything to protect me, if you are still with me, comment one word for what you're feeling right now. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. If this crosses your comfort line, you are free to stop here. The prosecutor asked the question that had been burning in the room: why stay, why risk a fall or a ruinous legal battle? Leona looked directly at the jury, her eyes finally welling with tears. She spoke of 2005, the year her daughter was diagnosed with stage 3 neuroblastoma. She described the crushing weight of a $580,000 medical bill and the miracle of an anonymous donor who settled it in full. She told them how she had traced that money back to my private accounts years later. "Mr. Garrison didn't just pay a bill," she said, her voice finally breaking. "He bought my daughter's future. He gave me my grandchildren. I was just returning the favor. Have you ever found out that your greatest protection was an act of kindness you'd forgotten 20 years ago?" I sat there, the wetness in my own eyes blurring the sight of my son's defense team falling into visible disarray. Kindness is a circle, and mine had finally come back around to save my life. As Leona finished her testimony, the judge allowed a rare moment of public acknowledgement before he could reach for his gavel. The gallery, filled with several of my own board members and strangers alike, stood in a wave of spontaneous, thunderous applause. The sharp wood-on-wood crack of the judge's gavel eventually cut through the noise, but the damage to the defense was already done. Merritt sat frozen in his seat, his face a white mask of pure, impotent rage as he realized that the housekeeper he had threatened had just sealed his fate with a story of a debt he could never understand. I adjusted the cuff of my shirt, the silk sliding against my wrist, with a whisper of the wealth my son was so desperate to inherit, and stepped toward the witness stand. The silence in the courtroom the following morning was heavy, a physical pressure that seemed to vibrate against the Dallas County stone. I took the oath with a hand that did not tremble, looking directly at the 12 strangers in the jury box instead of the hollow shell of a man at the defense table. Merritt's lead attorney, Pierce Sterling, a man whose expensive smile was as sharp as the legal technicalities he used to bury. The truth approached the podium with a predatory grin. The scent of expensive mahogany and floor wax hung in the air, but Sterling carried the faint, sharp smell of a man who enjoyed the hunt. He began with soft questions, his voice a smooth baritone, as he inquired about my recent bouts of confusion and the brain fog I had mentioned to several business associates back in August. I maintained a stoic, unshakable posture, refusing to give him the satisfied reaction of a man who felt diminished by his age. "Mr. Garrison, isn't it true? You've been having trouble remembering basic vendor contracts lately?" He asked, his eyes glinting under the cold glare of the courtroom lights. "I remember every contract I have ever signed, counselor," I replied, my voice a gravelly pillar of certainty, "especially the ones involving my son. Have you ever sat in front of a room of strangers and watched a man try to convince them that your own mind is a haunted house you can no longer manage?" The indignity was a slow burn, but I let it fuel my resolve rather than my temper. Sterling pivoted sharply, producing a stack of medical reports that made a dry paper-cut sound as he slapped them onto the podium. I realized with a jolt of betrayal that he was using the very Dr. Merritt had recommended I see in June, a man I now knew was a paid actor in their conspiracy as an expert witness to testify that I was mentally unfit. He read aloud selective phrases like patient reports, cognitive lapses, and signs of age-related decline. The lawyer's voice was a scalpel. He wasn't arguing. He was dissecting. He suggested that the high-definition cameras I had installed were not the result of legitimate suspicion, but the product of paranoid delusions born from a failing mind. "Isn't it more likely, Thane, that your investigation was just the rambling paranoia of a mind in decline?" He sneered, leaning into my space. My mind was sharp enough to catch the man who thought I was too old to notice he was killing me. I countered, my spine a pillar of Dallas limestone. Sterling didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for his tablet and revealed a secret audio recording Merritt had made of me on a peak poisoning night in September. My own voice filled the room, slurred, confused, and begging for a glass of water, while I struggled to remember my own wife's middle name. It was a digital ghost of the man they had tried to create. Sterling leaned in his face inches from mine, his expensive silk tie dangling near my hand, as he delivered the final insult. "Tell the jury, Thane, did you actually see her put the poison in, or was it just another ghost in your head?" The defense attorney's sneer hung in the air like a foul odor, his face inches from mine as he waited for me to stumble. I didn't look at the attorney. I looked at the 12 strangers who held my family's charred remains in their hands, and I felt a calm so deep it was frightening. I allowed a long, measured silence to fill the courtroom, my hand resting lightly on the coldness of the brass witness rail. When I spoke, it was with the projected authority of 44 years of leadership. "You call it paranoia, counselor." I began, my voice vibrating through the quiet room with a clarity that made the attorney blink. "I call it due diligence. It is how I built Garrison Holdings. I should thank your client for that recording. I purposefully acted more confused during those sessions, specifically to lure my son into speaking more openly about the plan while the cameras were rolling. I watched the attorney's smugness evaporate as I systematically dismantled his dementia narrative. I provided the exact chemical name and the precise titration of the ethylene glycol I had heard Merritt discuss on the tape, citing the dates of the Q3 earnings reports I had memorized despite the fog. The only thing failing in that room, sir, was my son's conscience. The blurred faces of the jury began to sharpen as they realized they weren't looking at a victim of age, but at the most dangerous witness in the building. Silence is the heaviest thing you can throw at a lie. I turned my head slowly, the smell of old wood and justice thick in the air, and forced Merritt to finally meet my eyes for the first time in months. He let out a sudden sharp intake of breath, his body shrinking back into his chair. "Merritt, I spent 44 years trying to make you a man. I said the words carrying the weight of a funeral oration. It took 5 months for you to make me a survivor. I told the court that the man who had raised him died the moment I watched the video of him mimicking my death. Gasps for a laugh. I spoke about the death of a father's love, not as a choice, but as a biological reality when the child becomes the predator. You didn't just try to kill my body. You murdered the father who loved you. I watched his face crumble, the entitled mask finally falling away, to reveal a terrified boy who realized he hadn't just lost the money, but the only person who would have ever truly saved him. Have you ever looked at your own heart and realized it had finally mercifully turned to stone? My final act of fatherly love was already in motion, though Merritt didn't know it yet. I revealed to the court that I had already set up a secret trust for the illegitimate child he thought he had hidden from me in San Antonio. I knew more about his life than he ever knew about himself, and even in his betrayal, I had ensured his bloodline wouldn't starve. I stepped down from the stand, the silence in the courtroom so thick I could hear my own pulse. The game of tea and smiles was over, and as I walked toward the exit, I didn't look back at the son I had just buried with my words. 6 hours is a heartbeat in the lifespan of a multi-million-dollar empire, but in the sterile hallway of a criminal court, it felt like an eternity spent watching my own ghost. I stepped down from the stand, the silence in the courtroom so thick I could hear my own pulse, and I didn't look back at the son I had just buried with my words. The hallway of the Frank Crowley building was a cavern of cold marble and echoing judgment. I paced the floors, the rhythmic click of my shoes, a hollow percussion against the ticking clock that would decide if my bloodline ended in a cage. Leona Ross sat on a nearby bench, her rosary beads moving in silent, fervent prayer. She looked at me with a sad, weary grace. "They have been in there a long time, Mr. Garrison," she whispered. I stopped my pacing to look at her. The truth doesn't take long to recognize, Leona. It is the consequences that weigh people down. As we waited, a prosecutor approached me with a startling update. Merritt's mother's family, people I hadn't spoken to in years, had actually contacted the office mid-deliberation. They had offered character evidence against him, fully turning their backs on the man he had become. Even his own kin were lining up to cast the final stone. Every time the heavy oak doors creaked open, my heart hammered against my ribs, caught between the desire for justice and the residual ache of a father's grief. Guilty, a 6-letter word that felt like a sledgehammer. The buzzer finally sounded, a harsh electric rasp that signaled the end of the long wait. We filed back into the courtroom, the air thick with a tension that made it hard to breathe. The jury forewoman stood, her voice clear and unwavering as she read the findings. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant, Merritt Garrison, guilty. I watched Merritt's shoulders slump, as if an invisible weight had finally crushed him. Lillian simply stared at the wall with the vacant, unblinking eyes of a shark. The judge did not hesitate. "It is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life. Justice isn't a healing balm. It's a cauterization. It stops the bleeding, but it leaves a scar that never lets you forget the wound." Merritt was gripped by the bailiffs, his face a pale, sweating mask of disbelief. As he was led away toward the holding cells, he turned back toward me, his mouth working as he tried to scream a final, jagged accusation. But his voice failed him, leaving only a pathetic, silent gasp. He disappeared behind the steel door in total silence. Lillian was led out next, her head held high in a performance of arrogance that no longer had an audience. I remained in my seat long after the gallery had emptied. The courtroom cleared, leaving me standing in the center of the room, the master of an empire that now had no heir, and a future that started with a blank page. I walked out into the cool Dallas evening, the weight of the verdict settling into my bones. I was a man who had survived his own murder, but as I looked at the city lights, I realized I was also a man who had survived his own family. The empire remained, But the emperor was finally mercifully alone. The ink on the disinheritance codicil felt heavier than the life sentence the judge had just handed down. It was the final legal seal on a relationship that had died in a teacup. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, the taste of cold coffee lingering on my tongue, like a bitter memory of the morning ritual that had nearly ended me. My attorney, Elias Thorne, a man who had spent 30 years protecting my assets, now adjusted his glasses as he prepared to erase my son from my legacy. He slid a stack of documents toward me, the smell of expensive legal vellum filling the air. I watched the digital cursor blink on his monitor as we finalized the transfer of my entire estate into an irrevocable trust for elder protection. The $31 million empire Merritt had gambled his soul for was officially out of his reach, forever redirected to save people who looked just like the man he tried to murder. I felt a cold, surgical satisfaction as I gripped my fountain pen. The scratch of the nib against the paper sounded like the closing of a tomb. "He won't get a cent!" Thane Elias said, his voice as dry as the papers he was filing. "Not even for a commissary snack." "Good," I replied, my voice steady and gravelly. "Let him learn the value of a dollar he didn't steal." I added a final provision that I hadn't even told Elias about until that morning. I made Leona the primary manager of the trust. My son's former victim was now his ultimate financial gatekeeper. Have you ever seen a man realize he's traded a kingdom for a cot? It doesn't look like regret. It looks like a trapped animal. I wasn't there to see Merritt's face, but I could imagine it perfectly. While I sat in the hushed luxury of Thorne's office, the scene was playing out in the sterile, echoing halls of the Dallas County Jail. 3 days after the verdict. December 23rd, a legal courier handed the notification to a guard under the harsh, fluorescent flicker of the jail block. Merritt was brought to the bars, clutching the steel with white knuckles, expecting perhaps a message about an appeal or a visit from the father he thought he could still manipulate. Instead, he stared at the words, "Total disinheritance and trust for elder protection." What is this? Where is my father? He screamed, the sound of his voice clanging against the bars like a dull blade. The guard didn't even look up from his clipboard. "He's not your father anymore, Garrison," the man replied. "He's just the man who owns your cage." The steel door slammed. The bank account hit zero. The end. Merritt's world didn't just shrink, it collapsed. As he began to tear at the papers, a final realization hit him like a physical blow. The guard mentioned that Lillian, or Laura, as the state now called her, had already signed a deal to testify against him in her upcoming federal trial. She had traded his neck for a slightly better prison hospital wing, leaving him truly alone in the dark. The sound of Merritt's cot slamming against the bars echoed through the block, a hollow metallic scream of a man who had killed for a fortune and ended up with nothing. I stood up and straightened my coat, feeling the weight of the building finally lifting from my shoulders. The sun was neutralized, but I still had a house full of ghosts to face before the year ended. On the morning of December 28th, the quiet of the Highland Park mansion greeted me like a tomb as I returned to begin the packing. The silence in my home wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, accusing vacuum that smelled of expensive floor wax and the ghost of the herbal tea Lillian used to brew. I moved through the halls with a roll of packing tape and a stack of cardboard boxes, the hollow echo of my footsteps, mocking the life I had built within these limestone walls. I began in the study, my sanctuary. I reached for the framed photo of Merritt's graduation, then the one of us standing together at the first shovel turn of Garrison Land Holdings. I realized these weren't memories anymore, but evidence of a man I never truly knew. Every object I touched felt cold, as if the house itself had died the moment the first drop of antifreeze hit the porcelain in my cup. Into the bin I whispered, watching 30 years of curated fatherhood slide into a box. All of it. The screech of packing tape being pulled was the only sound in the room, a jagged noise that felt like a surgical strike. "You built a fortress, Thane." I told the empty room, But you forgot to check who was inside the walls. I realized I couldn't live in a monument to my own assassination attempt. It was time to let the Highland Park life go. Is it cruel to refuse a dying man's last wish, perhaps? But Merritt isn't dying. He's just finally living with the person he chose to be. I knew the distraught act he was likely putting on at the jail was nothing more than a strategic move suggested by his high-priced lawyer to influence a potential appeal. Remorse was a language my son had never bothered to learn. The phone in the kitchen rang, shattering the fragile quiet. I walked toward the sound, my hand brushing the coldness of the marble kitchen island, where Lillian once prepared my daily health ritual. I picked up the receiver to hear the muffled, practiced voice of a jail chaplain. He spoke with the forced empathy of a man who dealt in lost souls, telling me Merritt was asking for a Bible and a visit. He told me my son was in a very dark place and was seeking a path to reconciliation before being moved to state prison. I felt a surge of cold iron in my veins, an absolute absence of the warmth I had once felt for my only child. "Mr. Garrison, your son is distraught. He's asking for his father," the chaplain said softly. "Tell him his father died in October." I replied, my voice steady and devoid of heat. He should know. He was the one holding the shovel. The line went dead. Just like the relationship. Before he hung up, the chaplain mentioned that Merritt's only concern during their confession was whether the disinheritance was legally reversible. He hadn't asked about my health or my recovery. He had asked about the money. The final thread of my fatherly obligation snapped with a satisfying silent click. I hung up the phone and looked at the sold sign resting against the hallway wall, waiting for the morning. I was 71, and for the first time in my life, I had absolutely no family, and I had never felt more free. The air in the house finally felt like it belonged to me again. The mallet struck the wooden post with a final echoing thud, driving the sold sign into the frozen Dallas turf like a stake through the heart of my old life. The morning sun hit the red and white wood on the manicured front lawn, casting a long, jagged shadow toward the front door. I stood in the biting winter air, my breath visible in small gray puffs, watching the realtor walk back to her car. She didn't know that the buyer of the estate wasn't another oil tycoon or a tech magnate, but a non-profit organization I had quietly funded through an anonymous offshore shell. By next spring, this $31 million tomb would be stripped of its pretension and turned into a high-security shelter for abused and neglected seniors. I took one final lap through the house, my footsteps sounding hollow and mocking against the naked hardwood. I paused in the kitchen, staring at the spot where the silver tray had once crashed, and felt a strange, cooling lack of anger. The luxury that Merritt had been so willing to kill for was now just a collection of empty rooms and bad memories waiting for a new purpose. "It's just a house," I whispered to the empty vaulted ceiling. It was never a home. I realized then that an empire built on the wrong foundations isn't worth the limestone it is wrapped in. Goodbye, Garrison Manor. I hope the next owners breathe easier here than I ever did. I walked back into the center of the kitchen and tossed the heavy brass keys onto the marble island. Key on marble. A tiny sound for such a massive ending. The metallic jingle marked the end of my tenure as a Highland Park resident, a finality that felt like a bell tolling for a man I used to be. Outside, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. Families gathered around Christmas trees in their own fortresses, oblivious to the man who was leaving everything behind to find something real. I climbed into my car, the leather interior smelling of cedar and new beginnings. The engine purred with a reliability my own flesh and blood never possessed. Leaving Highland Park felt like shedding a skin that had become too tight, revealing a man underneath who didn't need a gate to feel safe. I adjusted the rearview mirror, my hands steady on the wheel. Directly to McKinney Avenue, I told myself, my voice finally carrying the weight of a future instead of a past. Let the ghosts keep the chandeliers. I shifted into gear and began the slow roll down the long gravel driveway. As I reached the heavy iron gates for the last time, I saw something that made me tap the brakes. A single long-stemmed red rose had been tucked into the scrollwork of the gate. Beneath it was a small cream-colored note from Leona's daughter, the girl whose life I had saved with a simple anonymous donation 20 years ago. The ink was slightly blurred by the frost, but the message was clear. Thank you for having the courage to stay. The house vanished from my rearview mirror as I turned the corner onto the main road. I didn't look back. I had a clear road ahead of me, a new office waiting in the heart of the city, and by December 30th, I would be sitting in my first board meeting with people I had chosen, not inherited. I stepped out of the elevator and into a space that smelled of fresh white paint and possibility, a stark contrast to the stagnant air of the mansion I had left behind. 2 days after leaving Highland Park, December 28th, 2025, I stood in the McKinney Avenue office building a glass and steel beacon of the modern Dallas skyline. While my new headquarters was significantly smaller than my old executive suite, the windows offered a clearer, unclouded view of the city I helped build. I spent the morning arranging the few personal items I had kept from the wreckage, a photo of my late wife, from a time before the greed had taken root in our bloodline, and a small, empty tea tin that sat on my desk as a stark reminder of the price of blind trust. Leona Ross met me there looking remarkably different. She was no longer wearing her housekeeper's apron. Instead, she wore a professional suit of deep charcoal, the texture of the fabric reflecting her new role as the Foundation's primary advisor on domestic elder safety. She had traded her silver tray for a leather-bound planner. It is not as grand as Highland Park, Mr. Garrison, she noted, though her smile told me she preferred the change. Grandeur is a liability, Leona, I replied, adjusting the empty tin on my desk. Integrity is an asset. Let us get to work. I had already begun surrounding myself with people I could actually trust. I had hired Detective Reyes's retired father as my head of security, bringing an ally into my inner circle who understood exactly how the hungry wolves operated. Have you ever found that the most valuable things you own are the ones you can't buy with a wire transfer? I was beginning to learn that lesson at 71 years of age. We spent the next hour reviewing the mission statement for the Garrison Elder Protection Foundation. The foundation wasn't just a charity, it was a counterpoison to the world Merritt lived in. A young designer named Sarah, with vibrant energy and eyes that saw the world in shapes and light, waited nervously for my approval in the small conference room. She presented the final options for the foundation's logo on the cool glass of a tablet screen. I bypassed the aggressive corporate symbols of lions and towers, choosing instead a simple interlocking shield and hearth, a symbol of protection within the home. This one, the hearth, I said, tapping the screen. It looks like a place where someone is safe. It is perfect, Sir Sarah replied, her relief evident. I will send it to the printers immediately. Approving that design felt more significant than any multi-million-dollar land acquisition I had ever authorized in my 4 decades of business. It was the moment my survival transitioned into a legacy that actually mattered, a way to ensure that no other old man would ever have to look through a glass partition at a predator in his own breakfast nook. As Sarah gathered her things, a notification chimed on my phone. It was a message from my legal team confirming that our first beneficiary had been selected, the young nurse who had originally flagged my toxic lab results at the hospital. She had been facing a frivolous malpractice suit from a disgruntled wealthy family, and my foundation was going to ensure she had the best defense money could buy. I looked at the finalized logo on the screen and realized that while I had lost a son, I had found a purpose that would outlive us both. We would officially open to the public on January 2nd, 2026, just 5 days away, but the work had already begun. The city hum of McKinney Avenue traffic below felt like a heartbeat, steady and strong. The ink on the logo was barely dry when the first cry for help arrived, proving that the world is full of sons who have forgotten the hands that fed them. The day after we established headquarters, December 29th, I sat in my new McKinney Avenue office, the cold hum of the ventilation, the only thing filling the silence as Leona Ross entered. She didn't carry a silver tray anymore. She carried a manila file that looked deceptively thin for the weight of the tragedy it contained. Leona introduced the case of Arthur Vance, a retired schoolteacher in North Dallas. As I flipped through the pages, the crinkle of bank statements sounded like a death knell. His grandson had been systematically draining Arthur's pension under the guise of investment management. I felt a phantom metallic taste coat my tongue as I spotted the familiar pattern of unauthorized withdrawals and forged signatures. The grandson was using the exact same shell company network that Merritt had used to gut Garrison Holdings. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a signature. Why is it that the people we would die for are so often the ones who are killing us? I looked at Leona, who stood by the window overlooking the city hum. He thinks he is just borrowing it. Thane, she said, her voice heavy. But Arthur's house is already in foreclosure. I have seen this script before. Leona, I replied, my pulse spiking with an empathetic fury. I know exactly how it ends if we don't rewrite it. I met Arthur Vance in our small consultation room later that afternoon. He was a man of 75, with eyes like faded denim and hands that couldn't stop dancing to the rhythm of his anxiety catching the frayed edges of his shirt cuffs. His hands shook with the same tremors I had felt back in September, a rhythmic ticking that matched the office clock. He defended his grandson with a heartbreaking loyalty, insisting the boy had just hit a rough patch with some cryptocurrency ventures. I saw the same blindfold I had worn for decades, the absolute refusal to believe that the blood you share could ever be toxic. The bank statements didn't lie. They never do. Arthur's success doesn't require stealing from the people who love you. I told him, leaning forward until our eyes locked. That isn't ambition. It is an appetite. I realized then that my role in this new life wasn't just to provide a lawyer, but to be the one person who could look him in the eye and tell him the truth without flinching. Leona told me later that she had found Arthur because his nurse is the sister of the nurse who originally flagged my toxic lab results. It was a secret web of caregivers, a quiet army protecting their charges from the wolves in the family. I felt a surge of protective resolve that I hadn't felt since the trial. I closed the file and looked at Arthur's trembling hands, seeing a mirror of my own past. We are going to get your house back, Arthur. I said, my voice as steady as Dallas limestone. And then we are going to show your grandson what happens when you try to dismantle a garrison. Within 48 hours, our legal team had frozen the grandson's accounts and filed criminal charges. By New Year's Eve, Arthur's foreclosure had been stopped, his pension restored, and his grandson was facing fraud charges in the same courthouse where Merritt had been sentenced. Arthur called me personally on December 30th, his voice thick with tears of relief, to tell me he would spend his final years in the home he had worked 30 years to earn. That single phone call, I realized, was worth more than every dollar Merritt had tried to steal from me. I felt a profound sense of closure. My survival had finally found its purpose. Blood may be a biological certainty, but loyalty is a choice made every single day in the trenches of the real world. On the evening of December 30th, I sat around a reclaimed wood table in the new McKinney Avenue office, the scent of wood polish and aged scotch replacing the heavy, stagnant air of the Highland Park study. This was our first informal board meeting for the Garrison Elder Protection Foundation, and the energy in the room was electric with purpose rather than predatory ambition. Callum, a man in his late 30s with a sharp tech industry mind and eyes that carried the weight of watching corruption destroy families, sat across from me. He wasn't a stranger to this fight I had called him weeks ago, when I first suspected the depth of Merritt's theft, asking him to quietly track the blockchain signatures of the cryptocurrency transactions. Callum had been the one who confirmed my worst fears back in October, tracing the digital breadcrumbs that led to my son's gambling addiction and the massive hole he had dug in the company accounts. He had worked in the shadows, a guardian I barely knew I had, and now he sat in the light as a full partner in this new mission. He didn't just bring enthusiasm to the table. He brought a crisp, $2 million check that he placed on the wood with a quiet, firm sound. I watched him seeing a spark of the integrity I had once hoped to see in Merit, and realized that legacy can be passed to those who earn it, not just those who happen to share your DNA. I was startled when Callum admitted he was actually the anonymous whistleblower who had first alerted the forensic accountants to Merit's crypto theft months ago. He had been tracking the blockchain trail on his own time, sensing a foul play that I had been too blind to see. When you called me in October asking for help, Thane, I already had the evidence compiled. Callum said, his voice steady. I was just waiting for you to be ready to see it. I am not investing in a company, he continued. I am investing in the idea that being old shouldn't mean being a target. I nodded, feeling a deep mutual respect for this man who had acted as a guardian before he even knew my name. Your donation will protect at least a dozen families this year, Callum, I told him. Welcome to the board. A name is just a label. Loyalty is the soul. We spent the afternoon finalizing the operational structure, with Leona Ross providing invaluable insight, while her pen scratched softly on her notepad in the background. As the sun dipped behind the Dallas skyline, casting a warm orange glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the other advisors left. It was just Callum, Leona, and me in the quiet office. We shared a bottle of scotch. Not the vintage, overpriced stuff I used to use to intimidate rivals, but something simple and honest. We talked about the genetic lottery and the bitter reality that sometimes the people you share a name with are the ones most likely to stab you in the back. I looked at Callum and then at Leona, who was still organizing files in the corner, and realized I had finally found the family I deserved. We were a collection of broken pieces that had found a way to fit together and make something stronger than the original whole. My father used to say you can't choose your kin, but you can damn sure choose your brothers, Callum said, raising his heavy glass tumbler. I spent 70 years believing in blood, I replied, my voice reflecting a newfound peace. It took 5 months of poison to teach me to believe in people instead. I told them then that I had officially amended the Foundation's charter to give both of them equal voting power. My chosen family would control the legacy even after I was gone. I raised my glass to the window, the city lights reflecting in the amber liquid, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what the next generation would do with my name. It is a strange thing to reclaim the very weapon used to destroy you, but tonight the kettle's whistle sounded less like a warning and more like a homecoming. I stood in the small kitchenette of the McKinney Avenue office, watching the water come to a rolling boil inside a simple glass electric kettle. There were no silver trays here, no vintage porcelain tins with hidden additives or deceptive sweetness. Just standard store-bought bags and a clean ceramic mug. I had the tea leaves tested one last time by a lab yesterday, not out of a lingering paranoia, but as a final symbolic act of taking total control over my environment. My hands, which had once trembled so violently I couldn't hold a spoon without spilling my life on the floor, were now steady as I poured the steaming water. Just tea, Thane, I whispered to myself, the scent of bergamot rising to meet me. Nothing more, nothing less. Steam is just steam when you have nothing left to hide. I realized that to move forward, I had to stop fearing the mundane and start trusting my own senses again. The metallic ghost that had haunted my palate for months had finally been exorcised. No metallic tang, no dizziness, just heat. Leona Ross joined me a moment later, taking the second mug with a nod of deep, unspoken understanding. We moved to the corner window, where the Dallas skyline was a tapestry of light spread out before us. We drank in a silence that was finally comfortable, lacking the jagged edges of the secrets we had carried through the trial. She spoke softly about her daughter's upcoming college graduation, a milestone made possible by the life I had unknowingly saved 20 years ago, and the life she had knowingly protected in return. For the first time in a year, the liquid on my tongue tasted only of earth and warmth. It tasted of the simple, profound fact that I was still here to experience it. A cup of tea is a small thing to a dying man, but to a survivor, it is a holy communion with the present. "It's a good brew," Mr. Garrison Leona said, her palms wrapped around the warmth of her mug. "Honest. It's the best I've ever had, Leona," I replied, watching the city lights reflecting in the amber surface of the tea. "Because I know exactly what is in it." We stood there as the workday faded into the quiet of the Texas night. Two survivors of a war fought in breakfast nooks and courtrooms. As we finished, I reached into my coat pocket and produced a small gift-wrapped box. I handed it to her, watching her eyes widen in surprise. Inside was the deed to a small, quiet cottage on the outskirts of the city. I wanted to ensure her security was as permanent as the legacy we were building together. She had been my sentinel when I was blind. Now she would have a fortress of her own. I set my empty mug down on the windowsill and looked out at the towers of glass and steel I had helped build. I had lost a son and a past I thought was solid, but I had fought for every second of my future. The story of the Garrison poisoning ended here not with a scream, but with the steady, quiet sound of a long overdue breath. For 70 years, New Year's Eve was about the balance sheet of what I'd gained. But tonight, December 31st, 2025, I realized the true profit was in everything I'd finally managed to lose. I sat at a round table in a quiet, high-end bistro in uptown Dallas, the scent of roasted herbs and expensive wine filling the air. There were no flashing cameras here, no sycophants waiting for a crumb of influence, just a small gathering of people who had earned their place in my life. I had officially dissolved the Garrison Landholdings name entirely earlier this month, rebranding every asset and office under the Foundation's banner. It was a calculated erasure, ensuring that my son's name would never again be whispered in the corridors of Dallas real estate. Leona Ross sat to my right, no longer the shadow in the hallway, but a woman whose sharp counsel was the backbone of our mission. Across from me sat Callum and Reyes Sr., a retired patrolman with silver hair and eyes that had seen every lie Dallas had to offer. He had taken over as our head of security, providing a level of relaxed vigilance that allowed me to finally breathe. "You look 20 years younger," Thane Callum noted, raising his glass as the bistro fireplace crackled warmly behind us. "Must be the clean air of McKinney Avenue." "It is the lack of poison, Callum," I replied. "In the tea and in the company." My hands were steady. My heart was full. I was alive. I felt a physical vigor I hadn't known in decades. The tremors were a distant memory, and my mind was sharper than a honed blade. Before the others had arrived, I stood alone by the fireplace and watched a letter from Merritt's lawyers curl into ash in the flames. It had been a pathetic plea for mercy, a desperate attempt to salvage a life he had already forfeited. Seeing the ink vanish was the only response it deserved. The table was filled with genuine laughter and the comfortable clink of silverware, a sound that carried no ulterior motives. We talked about the recovery of Arthur Vance's home and the dozen other cases currently on our docket. Justice is a cold meal, but the warmth of real friendship is the only thing that can truly settle the stomach after such a feast. As the main course was cleared, the city of Dallas began to hum with the distant sound of fireworks being prepared. I glanced at my watch, 11 o'clock, knowing midnight was drawing near. I stood to offer a toast, my grip on the crystal flute firm and sure. "To the family we choose," I said, looking at each of them in turn, "and the strength we find when the masks finally fall." I looked at Leona, acknowledging the silent life-saving debt between us that had transformed into a deep professional solidarity. The bright, clear ring of our glasses clinking felt like a foundational stone being set. "Happy New Year," Thane Reyes Sr. said with a gruff, honest smile. "To a future you actually get to see." The clock struck midnight, echoing through the small bistro, and as the rest of the world looked toward a new year, I realized I wasn't just starting a new chapter, I was writing a completely different book. I sat back down, feeling the steady beat of a heart that was no longer under siege, ready for a tomorrow I had fought to earn. The quiet of the new year was different from the silence of the mansion I had left behind. I stood alone at the office window on McKinney Avenue watching the first sunrise of 2026 bleed over the Dallas skyline. The golden light cut through the glass with a sharpness that I finally had the clarity to appreciate, warming my face as I traced the timeline back to May 15th, the day the first drop of health tea hit my tongue. I realize now that the metallic taste I felt in September was actually my body's instinct, trying to save me a biological alarm I nearly ignored in favor of family loyalty. May was the seed I whispered to the cold glass. October was the harvest. I was being erased one sip at a time. The fog wasn't just in my mind. It was a physical barrier Merritt and Lillian built to keep me from seeing the wolves at the door. Every month of 2025 was a battleground I didn't even know I was fighting on until the very end. The cold touch of the window glass against my forehead helped me anchor the analytical detachedness I needed to view the wreckage. I had spent 70 years believing that building an empire was my greatest achievement, unaware that my greatest trial would be surviving the air I created to lead it. A year is just a circle of the sun, but 2025 was a descent into a cave where the only way out was to light my own house on fire. I moved to my desk, the rhythmic sound of a ticking desk clock marking the beginning of my new tenure. I opened my leather-bound planner, the smell of expensive leather and ink a comfort to my senses. I look at the stark white of the New Year's blank pages compared to the blood-stained entries of the year behind. I reflect on the bridge burning in December, the selling of the estate, the trial, the public disinheritance. And I feel a strange gratitude for the pain. It was the pain that finally woke me up from a 30-year sleep of unearned comfort. Trust is a luxury, I tell the quiet office. Survival is a discipline. The empire is gone. The foundation remains. I see the faces of Leona Callum and Arthur Vance in my mind, realizing they are the only entries in my assets column that actually matter now. 12 months. 5 ounces of poison. 1 survivor. As I reached into the back pocket of the planner to check for my business cards, my fingers brushed against a piece of paper I hadn't noticed before. It was an old, unopened letter from my late wife dated years ago. My heart hammered with a sudden, sharp rhythm as I unfolded it. Her elegant script warned me that Merritt had a hollow place in his heart that no amount of money could ever fill. She had seen the predator in the nursery while I was busy seeing a successor in the boardroom. I closed the planner, the leather creaking like the hull of a ship that had finally found calm water. I stood up, adjusting my tie, with hands that were as steady as the limestone foundation of the city below. I realized that my son hadn't just tried to kill me, he had accidentally made me immortal. I was no longer just Thane Garrison, the real estate titan. I was the man who survived, and I was just getting started. The walk to the elevator felt different today, my footsteps sounding with a new firm cadence against the polished stone of the lobby. After returning from dinner near 11:30 on this final night of 2025, I stepped into my office on McKinney Avenue and prepared for a final direct address. If you knew the exact price of your life in the eyes of the people you loved, would you still want to wake up in the morning? It is a question that once would have broken me, but today, I ask it with the calm of a man who has walked through fire and come out with skin made of steel. I sat in my new chair, looking directly into the cold glass eye of the camera lens, the red glow of the record light, acting as the only witness to my confession. I was preparing a message for the Garrison Foundation's inaugural launch, but it was more than a mission statement. I spoke about the anatomy of greed, not as some distant abstract vice, but as a slow-acting poison that masquerades as family devotion. I detailed how a man who built empires was nearly dismantled by a few drops of antifreeze, all because he confused the biological fact of blood for the moral choice of loyalty. This wasn't a speech born of bitterness, but a clinical warning for those who think their success makes them untouchable. Greed doesn't always come with a mask. Sometimes it comes with a tray and a smile. I lost my son. I told the lens, my steady eyes reflecting in the glass, but I found my sight. Let me ask you, are you drinking tea right now? Do you know who made it? It sounds like paranoia until it becomes your reality. I revealed then that this recording was my new living will. Any further attempt on my life by Merritt's remaining associates or shell company scavengers would trigger an automatic release of every encrypted file I have on my son's offshore financial crimes. I have ensured that his cage remains locked from the outside. Trust is a bridge you build with your own bones, and I had been the only one doing the heavy lifting for far too long. I concluded the message by defining what it truly means to survive. The real Garrison legacy isn't the limestone towers I erected or the money I hoarded in vault-sealed accounts. It is the shield I have now built for those who cannot defend themselves against the wolves in their own hallways. I addressed the audience as my peers, urging them to trust their instincts over their expectations. Every dry swallow before a difficult sentence was a reminder of the thirst I had felt when the poison was at its peak. Legacy isn't what you leave behind for your children. It's what you leave behind for the world because of them. I finally forgave myself for not seeing the truth sooner. My capacity to love wasn't the weakness Merritt believed it to be. It was the very thing that made my life worth saving. I reached for a glass of plain, clear water, the only thing I trust completely now, and felt the cool sensation against my throat as I took a slow, steady sip while looking the world in the eye. Stay vigilant. Stay alive. I turned off the camera, the red light vanishing like a dying ember. I checked my watch, 11:45, 15 minutes remained in this year that had nearly killed me. The silence of the modern office at night settled around me, no longer heavy with ghosts, but light with the promise of tomorrow. I sat in a silence that was finally perfectly my own. I turned off the camera, the red light vanishing like a dying ember, and sat in a silence that was finally perfectly my own. I stepped out onto the balcony, the crisp night air of Dallas filling my lungs with a purity that no herbal tea could ever mimic. The city stretched out before me, a tapestry of light and shadow humming with the restless energy of a crowd waiting to shed the skin of the past year. Leona Ross was already there, leaning against the railing. I had officially adopted her surname for the Foundation's legal charter, a silent, powerful reversal that honored the woman who saved my life over the son who had tried so desperately to end it. The Garrison Ross Foundation would be the name that outlived us all. The lights look different from up here, don't they, Leona? I asked, feeling the vibration of the distant crowd in the metal railing beneath my palms. They look honest, Mr. Garrison. She replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Because you finally see them for what they are. We stood in a companionable silence, reflecting on the long road from that first poisoned cup in May to this moment of absolute bone-deep clarity. I realized that the man who had almost died in that Highland Park mansion was not the same man standing here. I had shed my naivety like a poisoned skin, and in its place was something harder, wiser, and far more resilient. Leona handed me a simple glass of water, a silent affirmation of the trust we had forged in the fire of betrayal. I took a sip, the taste of pure, clean water washing away the last lingering ghosts of the year. Midnight. The world reset. So did I. As the final minute of the year began, the distant roar of the crowd reached the balcony like a rising tide. I looked at my watch, feeling the rhythmic, healthy beat of my own heart, a heart Merritt had tried to stop for the sake of a ledger. My hands were steady, my mind was sharp, and for the first time in decades, I was not looking for a predator in the shadows. At the stroke of midnight, the sky over Dallas erupted in a kaleidoscope of red, gold, and white. The boom of fireworks echoed off the surrounding skyscrapers, the blinding flashes of light illuminating the city I had helped build. The fireworks weren't just lights. They were the shards of my old life falling away to make room for something brighter. I didn't think of the son sitting in a concrete cell or the woman waiting for a trial in a hospital wing. I thought of Arthur Vance, the nurse who saved me, and the thousands of others the Foundation would shield from the wolves. To a year where we don't have to watch our backs, I said, raising my glass to the exploding sky. Happy New Year, Thane, Leona said with a warm, steady smile. Welcome home. As the fireworks began to fade into a soft haze, I noticed that the faint, ghostly, metallic taste that had haunted me for months was gone. It was replaced by the sweet, cold scent of ozone hanging in the night air, a natural, honest reaction to the world, proving my senses were now entirely my own. I raised my glass once more to the vanishing lights, the glow of 1,000 new beginnings reflecting in my eyes, and I finally let go of the breath I'd been holding since May. Looking back now, I realized the greatest mistake I made was not the empire I built, but the blindness I carried inside my own home. I believed that sharing the same blood meant sharing the same values. That belief nearly cost me my life. If there is one lesson from this family story, it is this: love should never replace awareness. A father's heart can be strong, but it must also be wise. For years I trusted without question, and that trust became the door through which greed entered my life. My journey was never meant to become a tale of dad revenge, yet survival forced me to confront the truth. Justice did not come from anger, it came from clarity. This family story is not just about betrayal, but about learning when to protect yourself, even from the people you once protected. If you take anything from this family story, let it be this: pay attention to the quiet warnings in your life. The small doubts you ignore today may become the storms you face tomorrow. What people call dad revenge was for me simply the courage to stand up and stop the destruction before it was too late. And through it all, I believe God revealed the truth at the exact moment I needed it most. So if this dad revenge story has taught me anything, it is that legacy is not measured by money or property. It is measured by the lives we choose to protect. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in Thane's position, discovering that your own family had betrayed you? I would truly value hearing your perspective. If this story moved you in any way, consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories. A quick note: while this narrative explores real themes like family betrayal and elder financial abuse, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't your style, feel free to explore other videos on the channel that may suit you better.